People are clearly desperate for an identity these days, especially in affluent societies as our economic conditions improve, our priorities naturally shift up the Maslow's pyramid, and we can focus less on physiological needs and more on esoteric needs. Nowhere is this more prevalent than in America. Americans have always been perceived as these soap operatic lovies, obsessed with themselves and getting caught in their emotions.
I've been through a lot in the last 4 years.
They're prone to thinking in self-actualizing phrases like wanting to find yourself. I often hear emotive statements from them when they talk about their work. Oh, this job just isn't for me. This isn't speaking to who I am. I spoke to someone from here once who spoke about how they lost their way for a few years, but she's found herself again after lots of soul searching and therapy. Lost her way, she said. Sounded like she was a dog. American tourists in foreign countries have this tendency too, to ask for things, expecting a service to exist to fulfill the need. A lot of these demands get laughed out of the park anywhere outside of America. I remember this American family at London Heathrow Airport once, the mother going, "My daughter's having a panic attack. Can we have your water bottle?" Everyone just stared at her like she'd pissed in the pool or something. The wet wipiness and celebrity main character syndrome can get really annoying, as it's such a socio-economic calling card. Not everyone gets to operate on those values, so you wish they'd just gain some self-awareness and just get over themselves. Lots of younger Americans, mostly the left-leaning ones, but I'm not going to say it's them exclusively, lack this self-awareness and would bemoan this pressure to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That America is supposedly this relentless capitalistic machine that forces you to repress your emotions and clock in to clock out. But outside of the severely poor, which you see in every country, not just the US, that seems to be a total myth. These moaners are actually ludicrously needy and don't realize how lucky they are compared to those living in other places. America is consistently measured as having more free speech than any other country, yet they're the ones who complain about having a free speech problem the most. Whether it's the supposedly liberal biased media putting a cap on what you can say, or the toxic masculine patriarchy repressing their emotional expression. Yet there's people who make a career out of talking about the things they are supposedly not allowed to talk about. There's more unrestrained emotion here than anywhere else I've seen, and the rest of the world just wishes they'd shut the hell up. It's a total lack of self-awareness. Same way everyone thinks they work hard until they meet someone who works harder. You can accuse someone to be an overthinker when you're the one who doesn't think at all. If you took the poorest people in America and had them form their own country, they would still be one of the richest countries on the planet. So there's this constant chatter about subjective and internal state needs that wouldn't be anyone else's problem in a less affluent society where you have earthier priorities like worrying about not having hot water. When I bring this up, people provide painfully predictable rebuttals about how it's okay to talk about mental health or that being open about therapy is beneficial to the world. Perhaps that speaking about such things is merely the harmless and innocuous signs of a culture's natural progression. Those typical Moat and Bailey claims are undeniable. Of course emotional intelligence is important, and of course you'd rather people were lucky enough to worry about esteem issues rather than physiological ones. But the individual is definitely over-empowered to the point of narcissism, which, in spite of stubborn arrogance having some utility sometimes, it isn't harmless when it becomes a clinical issue, and it's harmful to the person with narcissism themselves, with its comorbidity with depression and anxiety. There's ample reason to say that this mindset is self-defeating and damaging to the social space, and its damages can spread beyond America due to America's global influence. Jean Twenge famously talked about the narcissism epidemic and noted that it it is profoundly prevalent in the US, but Christopher Lasch, way back in the 1970s, already spoke about a brewing culture of narcissism. It's been backed up by studies that traits in the narcissistic personality inventory are more prevalent in the US. So it's been well documented by experts in multiple fields that egocentrism has always been an issue in the US, and it's continuing to soar to new heights thanks to the internet's ascendancy. This is an American personality disorder, and it's spreading all over the world with the Americanization of the globe. A personality disorder is generally when there's a mismatch between how someone sees themselves and how they perceive the world to see them. Make no mistake about it, this is a mismatch, and they often aren't conscious of the dynamic. It registers as narcissism and cluster B generally, but if you were deluded and existing in pockets of societal space where those delusions are appeased, perhaps by your equally deluded friends, or the media space now increasingly advocating for inertia, toxic positive self-love, and blaming the world for your shortcomings. If you're deemed inadequate, it's on your environment to accept you. Nothing is needed on your end by comparison. It's a trend in American media, be it self-help, motivational memes, or the growing assault on the hero's journey in cinema and TV. Any talk of accountability or voluntarily facing discomfort or suffering is considered problematic to many pseuds.
I'm done running. Huh? You. I choose you.
There's an alarming amount of POMO-adjacent academics writing journal articles dismissing anything like this as some cis-heteronormative, Eurocentric, white supremacist meta-narrative designed to repress the marginalized. So both low and high art are scorched by these developments in America. And because of its mass proliferation worldwide, it impacts everyone's expectations of the world. Even in parts of the world where this level of inertia could be catastrophically dangerous. Obviously, a bit of advocating for individualism and self-acceptance isn't a bad thing, but at the current dosage, it's not helping anyone. So whilst it's become cool to hate where you're from, as a lot of kids claim to hate America and put on this front of anti-patriotism, all of their movements demonstrate that they want to empower the self, even if they hide behind the pretenses of group identity or bemoan toxic individualism. They may claim socialist status or appeal to collectivism, but it's a disguise for an appeal to the self. Cultural relativism as a shield for individual relativism. In my culture, this is how we do things, as people would often say, whenever they want to be allowed to do whatever the hell they want and lack a more logical argument at hand. No one's more American and held up by American values of individual sovereignty than those claiming to hate America and demanding even more individual rights. Try hating North Korea in North Korea, you wouldn't get very far. So this is a symptom of the American personality disorder that Rolf Dobely calls the authenticity trap. The authenticity trap is the moral and psychological pitfall towards being yourself against reason, manners, and productivity. When people dismiss lazy and problematic behaviors under the pretense of authenticity. I'm just being myself. Let people be people. Where poor manners get excused with telling the truth, or your truth. A relevant metric here is having more choice. Even getting to think about aesthetic appearance is a luxury item in many ways. Speaking as someone who's lived in more homogenous societies like Hong Kong, when you get more choice, you're able to become more needy. When your choices multiply from generation to generation, what was once a privilege becomes a birthright, thus amplifying the mismatch to include even the demand for acceptance and celebrity-style worship. It isn't just that you want to accept yourself, but really, it's demanding everybody else to accept you too. From afar, it can seem that this is all Americans worry about. Their identity, how they're perceived. We abroad often joke about how high school seems depicted as this overly soap operatic event, loaded with world-ending gossip and plot twists. But even on the minute level, people are intolerant tolerant to anything other than unbridled acceptance of them. Look at how Taylor Swift fans couldn't handle their deity receiving merely lukewarm reviews of her last album. It isn't just that people disliked her new work, but that there had to be some grand conspiracy against her and her fans. Dissent even being met with, but what about women supporting women? To take offense at such a low register makes existing in the world much harder than it needs to be. So the merely innocuous sounding identity and self-actualization needs has grown into a devilishly unkempt version of self-serving and toxic short-grasping individualism, where it seems to really have no limit with the advancing ubiquity of rights and affluence. It's growing further upward and head-oriented. Celebrities at the highest end almost operate like Dionysian Greek gods, each vying for actualization. Look to the influencers worrying about getting the perfect shot of themselves, doing nothing for the clout. College kids that take offense to everything, acting out the Piagetian messianic stage of development in children. Or even the athletes who cry foul at being got at by the crowd because it's their legacy at stake, whilst being paid boatloads of money. As if any genuine man on the street worries about such issues. Negative crowd engagement and booze has always been a part of sports. It was the means for the less privileged to provide emotive feedback. But these days, players' PR and their disciples come out with think pieces about how they're being abused for merely being booed. This Westbrook video, where legacy or being thought of positively is spoken about as if it's a birthright, and people far below him in the social order watch that thinking that's a right way of thinking about things, or they support their petulance to fortify how they think life ought to be. There's no bigger tell that someone wants to be worshipped like a celebrity than those who worship celebrities and repost their stuff on Instagram saying, "Yas queen." It's how they themselves would want to be spoken about. What was once caricatured as the mo rights, gun-wielding types has now evolved into such demands and spread into the dimension of the mind. And it's not an easy ride to be so needy. People with borderline personality disorder are often described as perceiving more distress, even if the things that trigger the distress are pound for pound the same things that other people just swallow, and thus their lives are far more distressing overall. Children report dealing with more distress than psychiatric patients last century. When the threshold is low, one operates on a permanent state of distress. That doesn't mean we should just treat them as though their pretenses of distress are legitimate though. Certainly if their incongruence with reality comes from merely being born in a more affluent society. It's hard to feel too empathetic when people's chemical imbalance tells them it's the end of the world when their identity isn't seen as valid. It's like a cultural hedonic adaptation. When something great happens to you, you feel a sense of euphoria initially, but you revert to normalcy after a while. With people who've had to make the climb in their life, they always seek higher and higher Maslowian needs, getting increasingly concerned with self-expression. George Bush, for instance, eventually wanted to be known for his paintings. Millionaires start doing bizarro things like narrating audiobooks or wanting to be considered an artist and having fun with things, effectively rediscovering the child or free spirit.
The question I have for myself this year, the theme of this year is, can you be world class and have fun at the same time?
Right. So you think that the world class bit's been achieved, but the fun hasn't?
Correct.
I often feel like I'm not 100% understood when it comes to manga. Sadly, despite his success, Araki still felt misunderstood by the world around him.
When you have a society so pampered that they don't have to worry about the climb in quite the same way, the climb starts at the top with seemingly little space to go. That's why all these rich kids now start off thinking they're artists with no art to show for themselves. Having little distance to climb can be implicitly disheartening. Look at the activists who need to look for racism everywhere to validate their existence. It's why underachievers cry about trauma or hardship, so they're not losers, but merely martyrs. I'm sure all of us feel this intense desire to find a stable identity in this mediated world where nothing seems stable and the flux of conflicting narratives and facts gets increasingly paralyzing. It's no wonder people reach for the short-term solutions in telling yourself you're enough. Unfortunately, the correlation between thinking about yourself and perceived distress are utterly firm. The more you think about yourself, the more miserable you are. People who are high on the neuroticism dimension are more likely to experience negative emotions, such as anxiety, depression, anger, and guilt, whilst external self-consciousness leads to evaluation anxiety. To teach people to consider nothing other than their identity and self-esteem is the progenitor of the current crisis. But the issue is, in our current landscape of trade based on reputation and the aforementioned landing zone up the mountain with little place to go, I'm not sure we can help thinking about ourselves or our logo entirely. We have to think about ourselves and find a way to make it work without it brewing into something toxic and overbearing on others. Identity actually matters outside of the vacuum of the self. The floaty suggestions that you be at peace with yourself from bohemian gurus isn't helpful. And crucially, what's being regularly omitted is that you alone cannot decide your choice of identity is valid. That would be solipsism. Identity has always been a marker defined in relation to a group. You cannot identify as being taller and then demand to be treated as such in a place like Amsterdam. Obviously, you can move somewhere where everyone's shorter than you, and that's where this issue gets supercharged by the internet. A cultural melting pot where opinions are both more valuable and less valuable at the same time, with things like bias-affirming migration and echo chambers. For every drive wants to be master, and it attempts to philosophize in that spirit, said Nietzsche. The only drive left is then the classically American individual gratification. It's rooted in wanting love and acceptance but hamstrung by inertia. Instead of making any higher effort changes to yourself to gain this validation, people generate narratives that suit them. Southerners in America love telling people about how they're hospitable, this Barthian myth of Southern hospitality. But outside of opening doors for people and saying good morning to everyone, many of them live deeply personal and self-absorbed lives devoid of closer friendships, which inevitably leads to a worsened mood. There are loads of myths like this in society. Continually speaking about them seemingly reifies them to be legitimate, but it's often just an aesthetic. The picking and choosing of them for an individual can be wildly inconsistent and contradictory, but a consistent through line is laziness, the inertia in the way of true growth. When we play into these myths and narratives, you reward people for what they aren't. Many pickup artists talk about how their mental health worsens due to their dawning realization that their true self is so far from who they pretend to be to gain favor sexually. You're basically extending your bachelorhood indefinitely. We all want a real identity, and because it's hard to attain, we dismiss our laziness as authenticity or we put on fugazi personas. Whereas people in the past were forced out of this hemisphere of fakery by the earthier reality. A summer would arrive where you would have to stop cosplaying as Star Wars characters and get a job. Nowadays, you can prolong your fandom listening to the soundtrack on the way out of the cinema and become whoever you want to be online. Choice on an unparalleled level. We're increasingly reliant on media now, thus the rebirth of the hypodermic needle that has distorted our expectations outside of media. We start demanding from our reality what we can do online, such as blocking people.
There's just too many white people in here, and this is a space for people of color. So just be really cognizant of the space that you're taking up.
The longer you fake who you are, the harder it gets to start finding a way to live in the world as your real self. The deeper the hole you dig for yourself to climb out of. This has a feedback loop effect known as the hipster effect. When everyone allows themselves to be whatever they like, they all nihilistically end up doing the same thing. You become further cookie cutter and less of the much prized individual identity. Due to how long we've been operating in this social fakery and everyone validating each other's bullshit constantly, a lot of social dynamics have slipped semiotically. Social skills skills have eroded and become hyper-real in the Baudrillardian sense. What's dangerous is that the performed persona has become what's celebrated and legitimized as a real, genuine personality, and that what's considered authentic has shifted so much that people are clapping Will Smith off the Oscars stage for speaking from the heart.
There was a powerful moment for me to sit and watch one of the world's best emoters ever we've seen speak from the heart.
When to me, it sounded like any other crocodile-teared and ultra-rehearsed speech typical in US showbiz. If that's speaking from the heart, then we're in really bad shape. A lot of these people don't even sound like real people to me.
Growing up, sweeping the floor at my dad's hardware store and cleaning the bathroom at my mom's dance studio, I never could have imagined what my story would entail. And they sent men through that door over and over again for hours and hours on end.
The fuck? I genuinely think there's a widespread social ineptitude here compared to other countries I've been in. So many people aren't even aware that none of this is how conversation works. People don't talk to each other like this. But the fakery is so embedded into the culture. Young people are said to be losing the ability to read social cues, and that there's been a noted decline in reading facial expressions. People talk about Amber Heard overacting unconvincingly on the stand, but how many people do you know that trauma dump like that, like they're giving a performance?
Today is National Day of Remembrance for homicide victims, and my husband was brutally killed.
And then she starts crying, making the whole thing uncomfortable to watch. Then she turns the camera around on the poor barista.
The me main character narrativizations, the sob story and over-empowered voice, foregrounding their persona above all else, burying their true self deeper and deeper. It's so frustrating living here, seeing so many people live out this fugazi pretend world. It's like being in school and seeing the teacher's pet get rewarded, and everyone in the room tearing their hair out saying, "Can't you see what they're doing?" People largely don't see what's going on. Autism is rising, as is social anxiety and social incompetence, to the point where the few decent people I've met here are so used to this climate that they don't think they can review any details about themselves or their background without first prefacing that they're trauma dumping themselves. I remember genuinely listening to this girl on a date once, and she completely burst into tears because nobody ever just listened to her. There's a culture of everyone wanting to do the crying and less people wanting to be the shoulder. They're completely brittle to any level of genuine discourse. When you're in a society full of narcissism and you're a good person at heart, you just shrink to accommodate everyone and fall into the sunken place. You don't have to put up with it. You don't have to play into their delusions. And it's a childish delusion. The loss of listening skills, entirely analogous with Piaget's stages of child psyche development. When kids first play together, they broadcast their thoughts one-way traffic style before realizing they have to bounce off of the other kids enough times to make it a genuine dialogue. Kids play with each other less now and are raised being listened to so often that they grow into adults lacking basic listening skills and the ability to step into anyone else's world for even a minute. The Jungian puer aeternus chases their youth. When you were a kid and you played dress up or house, your delusions were entertained. Now, it's a lot harder to get people to believe you all the time, so the demand to get everyone to buy into your identity reveals a petulant desire. They know deep down that it isn't truly valid, even if everyone they choose to allow into their echo chamber tells them it's valid. Even if they think they believe it, they're always at the mercy of invalidation from someone outside of the bubble. The world is a dangerous place when that's how you think about things. So my solution to this issue is just to encourage recognizing that you aren't not yourself just because you've had to try harder or push past discomfort to become your best self. Relegating your self-conception to merely what your lowest base version is hurts your self-esteem even more in the long run. In regards to being yourself, what a lot of people have now misunderstood is that being yourself doesn't mean you're just lazy. Hardworking people or people seemingly filtering themselves more aren't not authentic, but we often see that accusation labeled against them. An unveiling of the tall poppy syndrome, perhaps. Maybe they disregard the people who listen, or at times play a side character role in being someone else's friend for once. Maybe doing something that makes their parents proud. They denigrate those acts of husbandry with utterances about how they'd rather love themselves or live life the way they want to live. Nobody can tell me how to live my life, but giving people what they want could be the emotivist choice of the person being kind. If what you want is to give to others, then doing so is a reflection of you nonetheless, even if you've filtered your front foot desires out temporarily. We think of the finger painting artist that sorts out something pretty within an hour as somehow more authentic than the photorealistic painter that takes their time and ruminates on every move. The former may be more raw, but they aren't necessarily more authentic just because there's less of a filter over a shorter span of time. Your hard work and discipline is you. You chose to get on the treadmill to suffer. It's still you, even if you aren't comfortable. As is human culture and invention what humanity is, not just irrationality and animal lusts. The popular and hyper-real version of self-love is a recipe for self-hate. Loving yourself means saying no to yourself sometimes. How can you love someone who does nothing for anyone else? You're continually signaling to yourself that you're undeserving of love no matter what you tell yourself. And if you're decrying being a slave to other people's narratives, whilst not being happy unless everyone caves to your demands, then you're not actually free. As Plato says, you're a slave to your lowest whims. We all fear not living up to expectations or being found out as inadequate in some box or ideal. That's why we dismiss all rules or deem categories to be limiting. The need for art to be realistic, manners, social tact, even going the route of being a family man or woman and being subservient to a cause. They queer these categories or principles to avoid being seen, dismissing reality as subjective because if it were objective, they would be categorized as the losers. People would rather have a false success in their fugazi identities than a crushing real failure. But that's, in my view, the best way to genuinely become an individual and gain self-respect. There's a reason why the best art and beginnings of music movements come from working class regions who have a lot more limitation. They're forced to become creative and inventive. Daring to fail is the only way you can truly have an identity. Aiming for something above yourself is the only way to stand out from the crowd of pretend hipsters. It's part of growing up, doing the right thing, and allowing failure to bruise you. The allure of pernicious, shifting identities and rhetoric may seem like a shortcut, but it is mere imitation. When we were children, more doors were open to us. We're spoken about in terms of potential regularly. We're good at math if we aced a math test once, or a creative kid if we drew something slightly better than the median in class once. We often hold on to these comforting views later in life and resist closing any doors to become anything legitimate, looking back with tinted goggles thinking we were good at more things when we were younger, when that simply wasn't the case. It was just a lower standard, to put it crudely. We still want to be good at everything instead of spending our time honing a true identity. It's scary closing those doors and turning your back on your childhood.
Ideas live forever. Humans not so much. You know that, right?
So the question is, what few do we keep open? Well, it seems that many of the classics still work. Love for others, community, being your best self, etc. As much as they're frowned upon, learning to play with others is certainly unmovable. Kids who haven't learned to play are frightened to death. They cry a lot more easily. The longer you retreat from it, the harder it'll get. It's what Jung calls the provisional life, a modern disease of merely living in your imagination. Cognitive behavioral therapy, bravery, voluntary exposure to these stressors. That's still the way to go. Maybe when people talk about masking, they should instead think of it as merely acting appropriately in a public sphere where you're no longer the most immediately important thing. We're reaching adult milestones later than ever now with regards to the emerging adulthood concept. Yes, it's hard to buy a house. I'm not referring to things like that. But I think the development of these social skills and communal ties are milestones that still still need to be met to truly become an individual. You don't actually know what you are unless you engage with other individuals. That's Lacan's mirror stage. It's scary recognizing yourself in the mirror and realizing you could be the subject of someone else's judgment, that you cannot always be the master to everyone else's slave. One hopes we can collectively grow up still. The hope is that with increased life expectancy and things like the ability for women to freeze their eggs, means it's merely a fractional cost to newer generations to waste more time. But we've all met people who've wasted all of their time, their whole lives, floating around like dead wood and are close to running out of all options. It's a terrifying scenario. We mustn't leave it too late to act. There is nothing more dismal than having ruined your whole life and having no one else to blame. Whilst we can't guarantee that everyone can be saved or that people can figure out for themselves the need to live constructively and putting the best foot forth, we can at least not make things worse by playing along to their delusions. What we can do is not conform enthusiastically to their actualizing wants, nor validate their evidently short-term fixes. Play no part in the simulation of the self. It's the difference between praising a child when they do well in school with telling them they're smart, or by praising them for having worked hard. The former aestheticizes an identity, but the latter is higher. Your personas may shift and contradict, but you can at least always be doing your best to do the right thing. The difference in reinforcement is known to make the biggest difference in encouraging continued positive behavior in developmental psychology. Your words have the power to shape people around you into what they ought to be. It might hurt to live in the real world. It may be isolating, dying by these values in America. But to paraphrase a great American, Theodore Roosevelt, it is the man in the arena that counts, not the armchair critic who wins every imaginary battle. Credit belongs to the man in the arena, covered in sweat and blood, who comes short but keeps trying. That's what true Americanism is. A real failure beats a false success. If you pledge yourself to the right aims, the classics that I spoke of, life takes care of itself eventually, in spite of the turbulence. You're not going to be happy every day raising a child, but when you get to see them grow up into a success, you can beam in happiness. If you just make sure the plane you pilot doesn't crash, you'll get to enjoy the clouds and scenery when you get to them.